All righty. Yeah, I think we're essentially at 11:30, so let's go ahead and get started. Um, I'm Thomas Bond, I'm the chair. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Tofty. He holds a master's from University of St. Louis, Missouri, and he'll be talking to us today in this coffee hour session, giving a talk entitled Fasting the Delicacy of War, the Socratic Introduction of War into the Republic's Peaceful Origins. So we'll have a 15-minute talk and then 45 minutes for a Q&A. So whenever you're ready, Michael, take it away.
Perfect. Let's see, I'm trying to see if I can, is there a way that I can share my screen?
It should be possible.
Okay, now I can, thanks. All right, so, perfect. So yes, so my talk is focused primarily on book 2 of Plato's Republic. And as Thomas said, focusing mainly on a pacifistic critique of how Plato argues and advances the introduction of the guardian class, but also just war in general. In essence, I have for this hot take theme, like 2 branching types of theses. The one that I'm going to focus on here primarily in the book 2 is the one I have most substantial presentation skeleton of, and that is the argument regarding the introduction of the guardian class into the polis. I think it's fairly inadequate, and either in the sense that Socrates himself is poorly evidenced as a epistemically virtuous agent, or that Plato's presentation of Socrates' argument is poor. One of the two. Either way, I think the argument has more flaws than some people think, and there's a detriment to the entire project of the Republic as a whole, based off how weak that is. The second thesis, and the one that I would be most interested in getting feedback in later, is I'm interested in how if there is a more pacifistic or non-violent or non-lethality strain of thought regarding throughout Plato, either in the Republic or in the canon, that it's even more negligent on the part of either Plato or Socrates for not examining and rigorously defending this, or at least positing why the introduction of war in the soldiery class is important and necessary. So with that, I'm going to turn to the argument in Plato's Republic. So as most of us know from introduction to political philosophy or some type of class regarding the Republic, Plato begins his interest in what is justice by creating this city. He starts with this basic principle, which I kind of called a necessity principle, but it's really more of a self-sufficiency. The idea that the city comes to be because no person is self-sufficient. The idea is that he wants to start with the basic minimum regarding a city and build up. So that way there's no extraneous things in the city. It's all about a model to find what justice is. What are the basic elements for a city? So from that methodology, Socrates and Plato's presentation of Socrates is focused on every thing being essentially necessary to that basic structure of the polis. So the reason why I'm saying that is because it starts with farmers, starts with tailors, and then it goes up into merchants, it moves up into craftsmen, higher levels. The idea is not to advance beyond what is actually necessary for the city to survive. This is further reinforced by the very end of this discussion, or at least the first phase of the polis. Before Socrates asks Glaucon and Adeimantus if there is justice in the city, he says that the city that he's created so far, the citizens will have no more children than the resources allow, lest they fall into poverty or war. It seems that even the biological, the reproductive, will be led by the principle of necessity. So what it has to all be regarding anything introduced into the polis has to be of this basic founding principle. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that the city up to this point has specifically no war. Here, war is seen as something that is going to be a devolution or something to be avoided or something negative, some aspect that should be, there is no war. The inclusion of war comes later in his account. Instead, right now, we actually have a vegan, at least a meatless and cheeseless society. We have a city with no soldiery class, no war. So far, we have a pacifistic, non-lethality, non-violent city that we're looking for justice. So that it should be the conclusion of about 372 B and C. Where we get the guardian class, though, is because of Glaucon. So none of the three, Socrates or his interlocutors, are able to find what they think would be an adequate idea of justice here. They don't say if the thing that isn't justice would be something that is equally admirable, but they just simply say there's no justice here. So what happens, though, is Glaucon makes almost an ad hominem attack, saying that the city is basically barely fit for swine. But in doing so, he offers the idea is that there are no delicacies, there are no meats, there's no cheeses, there's no fruits, there's no vegetables, there's none tables, anything like this. So what happens in this turn here is that Glaucon thinks that certain delicacies should be included, so that the citizens shouldn't suffer hardship, which already we are now introducing a new principle to govern this city, which either should be included in the necessity principle that Adimantius and Glaucon had already agreed on with Socrates, or it would have to be something that would supervene it with some reason for it to take priority over the necessity principle. However, with that, there's not really much of a defense, as I will show in a little bit. Instead, Socrates fairly quickly accepts Glaucon's suggestion. He only asks a question of implementation. He doesn't do his characteristic gadfly Socratic cross-examination like he does in Book 1 or in the other texts that we're fairly familiar with. Instead, he just simply asks, so how should I feed these people? How should I implement this? How should the delicacies be portioned? How should this be done? And the following implementation will require more types of food and resources, which requires more land, which requires more laborers, which requires a standing army to defend the land we have, as well as to steal from others. And the idea is that other cities will now think of us as a threat and attack us now instead of, as before, it turns Socrates has this implication or assumption that the original polis is no threat. So there's no fear of war. So it seems to, in Socrates and or Plato's view, there's no pacifistic variant of a polis with delicacies, at least minimally understood as a no lethality that's not consensually assented to. So where I would like to critique this is, the reason why I'm focusing on this section is that it seems that that with Plato and Socrates, obviously both regarding their biographies and in other texts, I could not charitably call them a pacifist by any means, and no one ought to. But what I think is interesting is it does seem that there is some sympathy intellectually, or at least in the text, to a possibility of a pacifistic polis, but instead they shift to the introduction of a polis with a soldiery class, and there is very little defense. And there's like three sets of this kind of critique that I kind of want to focus on here. And the first is what I said, to expand on what I said just earlier about the absence of this cross-examination here. So if we actually look closer to actually what Socrates does when Glaucon introduces this, it seems very uncharacteristic in comparison to other texts, such as the Laches, such as Gorgias, such as Credo, any of these, and that Socrates, Glaucon offers this new thing. The idea is that the original polis is not working for Glaucon. It does not seem to be fit or good or whatever. The best thing he says is, not fit for swine. What Socrates then does is he initially mildly assents. He goes, true enough. He doesn't push back on any of these assumptions here. He doesn't defend his original idea. He doesn't ask Glaucon to make a defense as to why delicacies are important. He almost just assumes them to be necessary based off empirical assumptions of Hellenistic political constitutions. Probably the best explanation I have. Then Socrates lists some examples he has forgotten. Like I said, meats, cheeses, fruits, vegetables, aspects like that. But what it seems that Socrates has already presented a fairly rigorous diet as to what the city would be founded on earlier. So it seems that it actually isn't what things he has forgotten so much as things that just simply weren't naturally assumed in this necessity sufficiency principle. And there may be a case that they may be forgotten, but it doesn't actually seem that they're actually truly forgotten here. So I think, so instead, to me, I just think he's just moving away from his original assumed argument parameters without critically evaluating that. And then further, he goes to Socrates asks, like I said, implementation question, not a why. and before Glaucon is even given a chance to defend his challenge. And then the final major point of criticism for me is that with the luxurious is the terminology, how he views descriptively these two policies. So the original polis is described as something that's healthy and true, and the luxurious polis, the one with the delicacies, is described as fevered. And he simply says, okay, we're going to set aside the healthy and true polis, and we're just going to move to the luxurious polis for the sake of our argument for the future, without any distinction as to why it is helpful for a heuristic of justice to be based off of something that is fevered or less than true and or healthy, or why an actual political constitution should be based off it. So whether it's an actual political constitution that the Republic is arguing for, or a heuristic, there seems to be some assumption that's just not explicitly spelled out. So that's why I'm a little concerned based off Plato or Socrates' epistemic virtue here. But then there's also some tension regarding Glaucon's defense. Glaucon eventually does offer up a defense. Like I said, it's this avoidance of hardship. There's no definition as to what hardship actually entails here. But as I said, we already had explicitly said that war and poverty were something that the original polis lacked, and somehow it was a good making feature that they did lack in some way. And here we're now including something that's specifically something that we've been praising the original city for not having, which is already one point of tension. A point of hardship, if we're concerning hardship in an ordinary plain sense reading regarding health or ease, we're now introducing a fevered polis. We're now needing doctors. We're now need for the meat consumption, for aspects like that. So it seems that there is some inconsistencies with the avoidance of hardship. And the other final aspect regarding with the war, as you can see in point 2, is that as much as Socrates says he's going to avoid whether the effects of war itself are good or bad, he does later describe how foreign powers view and are performing war because of this. And he uses a transitive they too to refer to the polis that Socrates is constructing. And it's a very negative description in the sense that it's surrendered themselves to the endless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limits of their necessities. And if one's familiar with, especially like book 8, detailing the political constitutions, the negative ones that Socrates is concerned with, this seems to parallel the oligarchy with the endless acquisition of money, and democracy and the surrendering oneself to a desire, and then a tyranny in the sense of like a pursuit of a single base desire that is not necessary. So we already have early on that this move towards something unhealthy, which will be righted with the soldiery class, but for no reason as to why it must be. And the final point of criticism that I have, it sets of criticism, is just simply there is this possible Socratic defense, besides the idea that it must be broken in order to be refixed, which Socrates doesn't offer. But that's the idea, is if you trace the word delicacy, it's only used one other time in the Republic. And that's actually in book 8 that I was just referring to. And here, necessary desires and delicacies are considered necessary desire for him, are those that a person cannot not pursue, in that they can't desist from them, and to the extent that they benefit the individual. So if this is true, then this entire move should be assumed within the necessary principle that I was saying that Socrates, Adamantius, and Glaucon had been operating under. The concern here, though, is that the desire for delicacies is necessary to the point that they benefit one's well-being. However, the description originally is not actually that such. They actually, as Socrates, I said in the earlier section, is that they're beyond, they're surrendered to the endless acquisition, but it's also beyond necessity. It's to the point where they're now a unnecessary desire. So even if that is a possible defense, the actual characteristic of war and the luxurious polis is something that actually contradicts what would later be a possible defense. And then the other possible concern I have with this is simply that even if this does work, it's separated by 6 different books in a completely different context, as well as a context that Socrates disparages regarding the democratic soul. It's not enough to advance the inclusion of the soldiery class, which, as one knows from reading the Republic, the introduction of the soldiery class leads to his entire theory of the forms, the entire theory of the philosopher king, the entire aspect. It's a fairly linchpin argument, but it seems to be incredibly weak. And just one example of this kind of assumption regarding war, if we want to look at the laches during discussion. I think that's a big, sorry, I bulldozed through all of that in the 15 minutes. But yeah, so in whatever kind of discussion, I'm welcome to zoom back in on a section. I personally don't know Greek, so anyone who knows Greek or is a better Plato scholar than I would love to do some type of deep conversation to any of those points. And I would love to also, as I said, I didn't discuss the concept as to if there is a more general pacifistic or non-lethality sentiment further in cross canon. So I'm welcome to have that conversation too. As I said, I don't have it as nuanced here. So I guess I'll just give it back to Thomas now.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so we can go to questions. I guess just raise a hand in the Zoom chat and I'll call on you for the question. If nobody's champing at the bit, I can start. Yeah, I think that there definitely is this pacifistic strain in other Platonic writings. 2 places that come to mind first. So there's the Myth and the Statesman, where no animals. So basically, in this kind of idyllic age of Cronus, everything was way better then. Animals didn't eat each other. Humans didn't eat animals. There was no war. There was like no strife. And we just like had philosophical conversations with the animals because they could talk. It's like one of my favorite myths in Plato, honestly. But it seems like he's saying something like, and I think there's a bit more explicit confirmation of this in Laws 1. It seems like he's saying something like, okay, maybe in like real human life, in like the age of Zeus, in like actual like realistic Greek life, we're never really gonna get rid of war. But we can imagine this kind of world where there's like no carnivores, there's no war, there's no fighting. There's peace and like philosophy. And seems to me that's what at least the Eleatic Stranger is sort of proposing as like the ideal world in that myth. And yeah, so in Laws 1, this kind of frequent distinction in Plato between the necessary and the best. And in Laws 1, the Athenian Stranger says war belongs to the necessary things, but peace and philophrosune, or kindliness or friendliness, belong to the best things. So peace is the best, but war is unfortunately necessary. And so, of course, in the Laws, we're going to do a bunch of, like in the Republic, there's a bunch of how do we prepare a soldier class for the city? How do we make sure we can go to war? But it's never seen as like this good thing in itself, or kind of ultimately good thing that we're going to war. It's just seen as a necessary thing. I think there's more evidence elsewhere. So one thing I'm working on is this, the just man will never harm anyone. That seems rather pacifistic. That comes up in Crito and Republic 1. But yeah, I definitely think this strain is there. I think some people sort of, because he's so, talks about war so much in Republican Laws, I think some people sort of miss it or think that Plato is like more martial or militant than he is. But I think you could definitely develop that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. Especially since I haven't actually connected with the Statesman. I looked into the Laws, so I'll definitely look into that later. But yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly the kind of when you said when you brought in the Laws here, that's kind of what I'm assuming is what's actually going on here, is that at best what Plato could possibly say is that if this is a political constitution, empirically, and assuming Hellenistic value systems and assuming how political constitutions seem to be operating, how human psychology seem to be operating, we have to assume that like war soldiery must be necessary, quote unquote, but it's not ideal. Which again may work for the political constitution, but it seems that I know there's a lot of debate regarding does Socrates and or Plato see the Republic as realizable or not. But like, so if it is realizable, there's that works, but to some degree. But if it's just a heuristic to looking for justice, then we have this new problem in the sense that it seems that then he would need to be looking for something that's ideal, something that is not just empirically necessary or assumed. It should be ideal to, if he's looking for what would be justice. So why would something that's imperfect be better and or equivalent to looking for justice? So yeah, that's the kind of distinction that I was kind of, I don't know, playing around with. The laches is where I kind of picked up on it the most, is in the idea that the whole discussion is on courage and bravery, but the assumption is the entire time that soldiery is the way of teaching courage and bravery, which was just odd to me in the sense that he didn't at all critique the idea that there could be some other way of teaching or developing or exercising that. Again, I'm not asking for like an entire book on that, but it's just an odd move, you know, I mean, an odd jump.
Yeah, so actually, I kind of want to stick up for Plato on that point, and maybe drag Aristotle through the mud a little bit. I mean, when I read Nicomachean Ethics, I mean, okay, I'm sure I've read a couple little scholarship on this, and people do sort of try to say it's more expensive than it looks, but like Aristotle really does talk about courage in a quite military vein, and almost like exclusively. It's really focusing on this like dying for the city in a battle kind of courage. But as I read Plato, yeah, in Laches, there's definitely this, and, for example, in Symposium, it looks like Socrates is courageous in the sense that he doesn't get phased in the battle, and he has this like intimidating look, and he helps Alcibiades in the retreat and everything. But I think for Plato, like the really important kind of courage is like, I don't know what to call it, dialectical courage, philosophical courage, because it seems like there's all these points in the dialogues, and also Symposium is a good locus for this, where we can kind of like give up on argument. We can sort of stop trying to get, Meno 86b, we can, stop trying to get to the truth because we hear some paradox or some sophist convinces us it's all just like a mess. And we just throw up our hands and say, all right, I'm just going to be very cynical and give up on pursuing real knowledge. And I think what Socrates takes to be necessary to combat that is a kind of like philosophical courage, where you endure, you keep pursuing wisdom, as Eros does in the Symposium, despite any pain, despite any, you might face death, you might face unjust treatment, but you still have to persevere in this, apology comes in here too. And I think that for Plato, that's the really important kind of courage. Like battlefield courage is like something, and yeah, it's like in a city, like in the laws, you do need it for sure. But it's really like a lower type of courage. The highest type of courage is this kind of erotic, Symposium thing that Socrates possesses as the, ideal inquirer.
Hannah Arendt actually brings that out in The Human Condition in reference to Socrates. She actually says that it's another why I was bringing into this is the idea is that just the appearance into public is itself an act of courage. Yeah, so it's, and she was comparing that to I should try to remember exactly where she sourced that from. I think Gorgias, it could be the Republic. But so the idea that you don't need to be, and she actually specifically says you don't have to be a hero, or she thinks Socrates doesn't think in the sense of an epic hero that you have to be a hero. The idea is that an ordinary person in itself is a hero in exercising this courage. So yeah, that kind of, I see this dimension to the Platonic and Socratic courage. Yeah, I don't think it's simply militant. But it is interesting that the militant is introduced, despite praising the non-militant, it seems, without further expansion. I don't know. But yeah.
Good. I have more, if no, but I want to. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So does anyone want to throw in a hand? Anyone else want to get in at this point? So I do have one quick point on Greek. So I did, I didn't remember this section well, so I just looked it up. The 559 thing you allude to in Republic about the relishes, it sounded a little weird to me. Like when I just heard it, I was like, wow, really? Does he say like relishes are necessary? And it is a little bit tricky. So, what I'd say is Reeve translates this well-being euexion, but I don't think that's a good translation. So What Socrates really says is, so he says, so he starts out like, isn't the desire for bread and relishes necessary? I think so. And then he says, okay, bread's necessary and that it's beneficial and that we are going to die if we don't have bread. Okay, fine. But then with relishes, what he says is, and relishes, if in some way they furnish benefit with respect to euexion. And ooexion, I don't think well-being, it's really a good habit of body or a good state of health, kind of a physical term. So I think he's saying, in as much as, or, to the extent that, or if they really do, if these relishes really do improve our body or make our body better, then they are beneficial, but only to that extent, right? And so that's why well-being, which, I think is the word that Reeve uses, right? He says,
it is.
I mean, it's true. Okay, so it's true that hexis, so like Aristotle, this is the word Aristotle uses for virtue as a hexis concerned with choice and all that stuff. So hexis is just kind of like state. But ooexion, I mean, I think in this context we should take it as a term that relates to the body as opposed to the soul. So yeah, that's my gripe with Reeve, but yeah.
Okay, but in that case, I feel like that's even worse for Plato than the other way, in the sense that if it is for the body and not the soul, then you can't appeal to some Gorgias-like argument in the sense, or even in the sense that like the body is like he defends the idea that you can use some type of just death penalty because the body is separate from the soul, and the soul is better and can't be harmed by the body. I see two problems if it is more bodily than if it is soul or holistic. One is that like now the benefit is something that Socrates and other work seems to see as superfluous in some sense, not in the complete sense, but not nearly as much as the soul is. And the second concern is still the concern about the extent, and the extent still ends up in this case to be leading to some type of endless acquisition that's a surrender, that's a fever that needs to be countered. So I guess maybe I should have framed this in some type of a parallel, is that how Socrates is arguing is like you start from something that's either a health or health or reminiscent to health, something like that. It's at least not dishealth. Then you have to move the city into dishealth and unhealth, and then restore it to health. And so I guess my question is, why is it necessary to move from a neutral or good position into dishealth and then restore it instead of continuing the original? There's no defense as to why. So I guess I'm curious what you would say to both of those two responses, because those are the two things I've been playing around in my head.
Good. So I think I understood the second. So I mean, I was thinking of a few things during the talk. I don't know a ton of the scholarship here. I think some people say it has to do with thumos. Like Glaucon is spirited and somehow relishes like bring in thumos, and we need that for the tripart. Like I don't really know about that whole line. The ones that I seem more plausible to me, it's like, I mean, we want to have this city soul analogy, right? I take it like Plato, one of his big, maybe the big thing he wants to do in the Republic, or, okay, there's a lot, but, he wants to say, here's the city with these parts, here's the soul with these parts, look at the analogy. And it's not going to work unless, I mean, like actual people have like diseased souls. He doesn't, I mean, pretty much everyone has like a lot of issues going on in their soul. So, for Plato. So he's going to have to transition from, like, the city of pigs isn't going to get you the city soul analogy would be one idea, and he wants it. And so he's going to have to show us like the city that's more like how people actually are in order to do the psychology he wants to do, like in book 4. And the other thing to say is that, I mean, just like, it seems like there's a more straightforward, I mean, maybe you addressed this in the talk. I was kind of thinking about I was thinking about a lot of stuff. But I mean, it seems like, they can't find justice in the whole point of making the city, right, is to find justice, but Adeimantus is struggling to do that in the city of pigs. So you have to go somewhere, right? Like, he's just trying to get Adeimantus and Glaucon to be able to like locate justice. And Adeimantus is like, oh, maybe it's like in some need the people of each other, but we haven't like gotten to the point where they can see it yet. And so, I mean, like, why does it specifically have to be a luxurious city, or a luxurious city of this kind would still be tricky, but it seems like the city of pigs, even if it is like the true and healthy city, isn't going to get us what we want on that level either. I was thinking, I don't know.
I guess what I would probably, in my defense of Plato here and Socrates, is this move works really well as a heuristic for maybe finding justice, and I can buy that. But once you found justice, it doesn't do well for political implications or ethical implications beyond that, in the sense that it doesn't seem to be, there needs to be a little bit more substantive reasons to why we should draw further implications from here that are not just simply the idea of what is justice. If it's simply what is justice, that works. But the question of if justice is the best virtue and if it's good in of itself, it seems that we have this city that doesn't have justice, and it still seems to be true and beautiful, or true and good, or true and healthy. Which again, I'm not saying that there's no answer. I would probably still almost agree with Plato in some sense, that there needs to be further expansion. It's just, it doesn't seem to be any explicit return to that kind of defense. It just seems to be a gloss on the road, but it's a very, obviously, you don't get, as you said, books 4 without introducing a soldiery class.
I guess another commonly alleged problem is there's no philosophy in the City of Pigs, right? And it does seem like the thing for the individual. So it's, I mean, it's a weird situation in a way, but like, seems like he's saying, well, the best city he describes in the Republic, at least on a lot of people's reading, is one where the best individual can't live, which is kind of surprising for Plato. I think those would go together. But he clearly thinks in books that, like, it's very clear that the philosophical life is the best life. I mean, I don't think that that's in dispute. And I don't see how, it doesn't, they sing hymns to the gods. That's like as close as they get, I guess. But they're not really doing philosophy. So, yeah. Oh, yeah, good. AG.
Hey, cool. I don't know anything about Greek, and I barely know anything about Plato, so I was glad to let Thomas ask questions. But I know like a couple of things about pacifism, and so I'm kind of curious what you think, or if you could talk a little bit about this argument or this idea, what it'll do for that conversation more broadly. Like, are there a lot of folks who look to Plato as does his position come up much in discussions of kind of the ethics or the propriety or whatever you want to call it of pacifism? Like, what difference will it make if we say, all right, Socrates is a pacifist, therefore we should be pacifists too? Like, I don't think that's going to be, like, it's not going to be that gauche, but what do you think about kind of the impact of this more broadly?
Oh, sure. I mean, for one, if our goal is to find Socrates or Plato being a pacifist, I don't think that's going to be possible without being uncharitable. But to be fair, in pacifist anthologies and aspects like that, obviously the most there are selections from Plato that are included. The most common is the 2-page discussion in the Credo regarding, the idea of better not to do evil, that kind of thing. Obviously, that is very much, even though that may be sympathetic to a lot of pacifist ideas, it's obviously fairly taken out of context, and there's a lot more nuance to that area. So Plato does factor into it, but I would say probably the more significant aspect, I think the more implications would have for so some polyphil and Greek scholarship, but for pacifist aspects, there are a train. I would be thinking it'd be more interesting to see if it at all critiques anyone who founds any assumption of war in Plato. I'm thinking particularly of like any Christian Neoplatonic thinkers like Augustine or someone like that, who are drawing fairly heavily from Stoic and Plato to allow for some type of Christian permission to use war, whereas the early Christians like Tertullian and everyone else is very anti use of war. Whereas Augustine, and I believe it's not Origen, it's Augustine and I think Ambrose use it as a missionary tool. But if you can show that the Platonic origins of their ethics, that there's no reason to assume that militant aspects is necessary for this type of ethics without assuming a cultural. I guess that's what my thing is. If you can show that they move to some type of non-pacifistic ethic is not some type of rationally argued in this Platonic strand. It's assumed based off other cultural practices and assumptions and normative. It's not explicit. It's assumed in aspects, and there are strands in there that are explicit that could be chained together. Then you can show that there is more of a debate and that you don't have to fall upon that idea. So I think that would be the more likely implication. Again, I don't think it would have any hard implication because most pacifistic thought are not going to be founded in Plato, for one, because Thomas has said, I mean, the Republic uses a lot of military language, even if it is not militant in the sense, it's a lot of Plato's allusions are going to come from his time in the soldiery, and almost all of his fellow interlocutors are in the soldiery. They don't normally found their pacifistic thought in Plato outside the Credo and maybe portions in Gorgias regarding, especially the ending part of Gorgias, where it's kind of like beforehand, it's all the just punish, doing just putting an unjust person to death is fine, but at the end, it seems that no matter how much insult you're done, you should suffer it kind of aspect, that last 2 pages. But like I said, there's not like a firm, explicit train of thought in Plato. I mean, he was in the military, and so was Socrates. I mean, wrestling and yeah. But
yeah, I wonder what I mean, EK said he's got something to say, but I like I was mostly like tongue in cheek with the if Plato's a pacifist, we should be too, or if Socrates is a pacifist.
Yeah.
But I like the idea that it's like I'm getting an image of like like the Tom and Jerry cartoons where they like take a brick out from underneath one corner of the house and it eventually falls over. Like if the house is it's Augustine's just war theory, and this is like a way to take a brick out from under that by saying it's founded on something different. I like that.
Well, yeah. Basically, my question is, I just want to be clear that it doesn't seem that it's necessary, like philosophically or rationally here. At least in Plato's case, there could be a case. I think you could follow Plato and Socrates and create and construct one. But in the text, it seems that he requires a lot of Hellenistic cultural assumptions or empirical assumptions, which I don't know. Maybe if we were there in the conversation, we'd be like, obviously this follows. But in the text, if it really is this, we're going to think about what the nature of justice is and construct it from this ideal city, it doesn't seem to necessarily follow without some concerns or criticisms. And if that's the case, well, then if now we're having this debate about assumptions and there's different directions that could be done, well, then you don't need to be indebted to that strand is basically kind of what I'm trying to suggest. I don't think that you can go further than that without being uncharitable to the biography of who Plato and Socrates are, or the text. Like you could, yeah, like you said, there's no way you can make them a pacifist. There's just no way. I mean, especially with the suicide. I mean, like maybe if you say it's consented to. I mean, like they're not against lethality.
Good. So if I could just add one brief. So it's clear that Socrates served seems like three big campaigns, right? So Amphipolis, Delium, and Potidaea. But Plato's military service is debated, actually.
Okay.
There are sources. I mean, you can find sources online that'll just say like, yeah, he served from like 409 to 404. But nails the treatment where she just kind of withholds judgment. Deborah nails the people of Plato, and yeah, it's just hard to say. I think it would be in this like early part of his life that we just don't know much about, and something from Aristoxenus about it, but it doesn't really make sense of the chronology. So yeah, I think it's actually hard to say for Plato. A lot of mystery with his life. Good. So yeah, did EK want to get in?
Yeah, thanks. As you're talking, this is great, by the way. Thank you. I just wanted to go to the late 19th and early 20th century. You have the Cushing School of Neuromedicine in, I think that's in New York. And they have this very Platonic idea of what we would call PTSD now. And they called it neurasthenia. I don't know if you guys know this. Neurasthenia, it was, before there was shell shock, it was neurasthenia. This comes out of, I think, at least in America, the Civil War. And it's also, this is what's most interesting to me about it. It's also, civilians can get this PTSD, but it's a function of living in the city. And they've said that city life is inherently bad for a virtuous internal life. And the cure is to go out and be in nature. So this is where the machismo thing of Teddy Roosevelt comes from, for one. And the guy who started the genre of the Western, like the Western novel, was part of this too. But it was a movement called Universal Military Training. And they had these camps. The biggest one was in Plattsville, New York. And tens of thousands of New Yorkers, especially, would go out every year and like pay money to have these Civil War veterans yell at them and force them to ruck march and camp out in the mountains. Anyway, I find that very interesting. I'm sure they were aware of Plato. I've never actually seen that argument made, but I can't imagine that they wouldn't be aware of this. The connection of like the city and this unhealthy thing, and then war for them is the answer. I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I will say, yeah, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, because the idea that the city, the debate of the city being the health or dishealth, I mean, there's a presence in Aristotle and Plato, and I mean, obviously Hobbes, and all these obviously showing cases in which some cities in which can be non-conducive to health, some that are definitely are, or any the way you're phrasing this, I don't know, I keep thinking the transcendental and romantic movement of like the 17th and 18th centuries in England and Thoreau and Emerson. Obviously, though, the interesting contrast that you're presenting is all of those, I would imagine, would be refraining from war and entering into some romanticism, some transcendental, some explore to nature, whereas they wouldn't solve it regarding introduction to the military. That's interesting. I will say, though, the thing that would jive away from the Platonic picture as Plato presents it is that Plato does, I will say, that has some conditional pacifism in the sense that those who, in the sense that, like, so what I mean by conditional pacifism is that some people should be refraining from military or lethality work, and those would be, which is interesting, the way you're presenting is it's those who aren't in the soldiery class, any of the workers, any of the people that would correspond to the appetitive part of the soul, shouldn't be trained as soldiers, shouldn't be exposed to the horrors of war. They should be basically living as pacifists. The idea is that there should be some reserved away for war, and those are the soldiery class and potentially the philosopher rulers. So that's interesting because I can see the parallel while you draw that, but at the same time, it's almost the inverse of the Platonic argument, as well as the inverse in the other direction of what I am proposing. So I don't know. It's just a very interesting, but I can't really speak to it because I don't know much about that tradition. But I will say, like, that picture would violate the Platonic idea of reserving war for those who aren't trained, or reserving war for those who are trained.
Yeah, it might very well be a misreading of Plato in that case.
Yeah, but I mean, I will say it's interesting because I haven't heard of a specific named tradition that would advocate for something like that. I don't know, it's outside of something like maybe IDF in Israel, where they have, universal conscription, or maybe Switzerland, but like I have never heard of many other situations in which they would universally expose someone into a military training because the city is unvirtue. I don't know. I've never heard that that's the way to get virtue.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, and I think it's over by World War II. It's General Leonard Wood. He was part of this Cushing School, and I think he was like military governor of Cuba at one point in the Philippines. And he says that pacifism is moral syphilis, and that's I mean, it's a fascinating connection to make. So yeah, thanks again.
Interesting. Can you drop the name in the chat? I'm probably going to do a Wikipedia search on this later. At the very least, thanks. But
good. Sanjana?
Yeah, so I guess one thing that I was thinking about is maybe it depends on how, if you can read Plato or Socrates as a pacifist. Okay, actually, no, I'll focus on Socrates. Whether you can read Socrates as a pacifist based on whether you see him more as a philosopher or a politician. I'm thinking of that essay from The Promise of Politics at the very beginning, where Arendt obviously goes into both and then suggests that he's both a philosopher and a politician par excellence. So maybe it's that tension that's kind of creating an issue. I don't know that.
it might I'm assuming there's two ways of thinking about it. I'm sure I'm answering it in the other way than you're intending. But I think the idea does map to my concern regarding the heuristic versus the realizability. The idea that there is two ways to read it as a work of philosophy, as a work of politics, work of political constitution as a work of philosophy and ethics, or some, and those can be in tension here, which is why in one case it seems to be working, but then it seems to need, you need, like in the case of trying to figure out what justice is, it seems to work, but then you need some other explanation. But in the other case, it seems to be a possible political theory, but you just need to say why it's the ideal. Like that, I can see how that tension maps to the kind of dichotomy I was saying earlier. I think you're trying to say something further about Socrates himself, though, in that, right? You're not trying to say what I'm saying.
I think so, yeah. I think it's about, maybe my question is more about whether you can, what the character of Socrates actually is, and whether that maps onto whether he can be held
Okay.
kind of pacifist tendencies, but I don't know if that.
Okay, interesting. So for the sake of this, we're excluding his past biography. You're just talking about, do his words map onto something that's a pacifistic tendency or not? Yeah. Okay. No, I think there might be something to it. If you're reading him as, I will say, I think the default, though, to read him here, though, does seem to be he is trying to act in the philosophy role in the context of the Republic more so, whereas maybe in another essay, it would seem to be more political. No, but I think there might be something to that, at least to help differentiate the two. Thomas quickly jumped up, so I'm assuming you have something to follow up on Sanjana's or is it completely separate?
It's actually like a follow-up on X, but okay. Yeah, you could, if there's more to say here, I don't want to.
I'm sure I'll think of something later, and if not, I'm sure I'll tell Sanjana later anyways. So go ahead, Thomas.
Cool. So, well, yeah, one thing I just wanted to say on the military training part, it's kind of interesting that, yeah, in the Republic, I think it's right that, well, okay, so yeah, the soldiers and I guess like the philosopher rulers have military training, right? But the craftspeople, it seems like, don't. But in the laws, we have a different way of dividing the citizenry such that everyone gets military training. Take it. And he's kind of big on emphasizing like women need military training. Like your cities are not doing this, and you should be, training women as well as men in this stuff, and throwing javelins with both hands. And I take it now, of course, in the laws, not everyone's a citizen. So, I mean, you've got the citizens and then you've got like the foreigners and the slaves and, visitors and all this stuff. So not everyone is getting military training in the city, but it seems like the citizens do. And I mean, the citizens are the ones whose like whole job is to try to become virtuous. So I think both there and in the Republic, it looks like Plato thinks, and this is another sort of interesting thing, because again, it's like, in some sense, war is not the best, it's necessary. And he does tell these myths where there's no war anymore, where life seems better. But at the same time, like in the actual world, it seems like to develop virtue, he thinks you do have to go through something like military training or something similar.
Mhm.
I mean, you talk about, the stuff in Republic about, and I think it comes up in a lot of dialogues, but this idea of like, we've got this kind of gentle persuasiveness related thing in us, and we've got this like sharp and how to describe it, like the courage thing that can turn into too much anger or competitiveness or stuff like that, and we need to like temper those properly. And so I think he thinks that military training is a very, military and musical training are kind of how we get those in the right states, and that's very important just for life, not for like winning a war necessarily, but just to be like a good citizen, you have to have that like correct balance between your courage and your sophrosyne, basically. Yeah, so that's one thing to say on that. And I don't know whether to say that his view changes over time or just the laws is a different kind of city. So, second best city. So he describes it differently. But it is interesting that the citizens and the laws are more like on a single level in some sense than the Republic classes.
That's true. I've been trying to. No, you can continue after.
No. That's good. Yeah, go.
I was just gonna say, like, I think this is interesting. I need to go through the laws again. I will say the reason why I omitted the laws from my original draft paper was just simply because, as you said, there is significant difference between the constitutions. So it's not like one easily maps to the other. So my original argument was simply on the book too. But then the other, maybe I feel like Plato better than I do. I feel like I've encountered, at least in my Plato course with WashU, that there is debate regarding the consistency regarding the thought and or author of the Republic and the laws, if I'm right, at least in the sense that the statesman is the one speaking and not Socrates, and that there's some question of consistency. Should I be concerned about that if I develop that?
Yes. There's a really weird thing in Aristotle's Politics where Aristotle just like says that Socrates is the speaker in the laws, and everyone is like, what the hell is Aristotle talking about? Like, that's the Athenian stranger, Aristotle. There's a lot of debate about like who the Athenian stranger is, what's going on with that. There is also debate about the extent to which Plato might have either left the laws unfinished or like collaborated with, for example, Philip of Opus in writing the laws. There's a good paper by Nails and Thesleff on this. They kind of take the view, they kind of have a radical view in a sense, but they say like the laws is not just like, don't think of like Plato in his study sitting by himself writing the laws. Like, that's not how it happened. Now, they're not saying he didn't have a hand in it, but they're saying like it could kind of be like an academy production. Whereas most people just sort of say it was Plato. But there is some debate there. And of course, yeah, the fact that it doesn't look like Socrates is in the laws and it's like the one dialogue he's not in has also caused a lot of people to wonder what's going on with that. And maybe the stranger has different views than Socrates. Yeah, there's definitely stuff in that area. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Let's see. And I did want to ask one quick question on Opsa.
Sure.
So, relishes is the normal translation. And I think it's a fine translation. But there is an interesting aspect of Opsa, which is that I guess in Homeric times, the Opson was like, you had your, you read like the Iliad, they're always having a feast, right? With like a bunch of meat being cooked and bread and like drinks, right? And Opsa was originally like the meat part of that. So the bread is never, bread is the not opson thing, but the meat was called like the opsa was meat in that's how the word was used like back then. And then so there's an interesting paper by Dombrowski, I think Dombrowski 1984, where he talks about how maybe that's what it means in Republic Book 2 as well. And usually people don't usually people say, oh, it's like sauces or it's like condiments or like relishes or something like kind of fancy and additional. But he's like, well, maybe it's meat because it seems like meat is the problem, right? It's like you talked about this a bit, right? It is vegetarian until we get to the whole city of pigs is vegetarian. And then when the war is, caused by needing more land to raise the animals for meat. So it seems like meat causes the city to become like militant or develop a military. And so Dombrowski's idea is like the word opsa can mean like pieces of meat. And it would make a lot of sense if Glaucon is saying, it's funny, Glaucon is saying, where's the beef? And Socrates is saying, you want beef? Well, then you're going to have war, So that's just one idea. I don't know what you think of if you thought about the translation at all. It's a hard word to translate because it means like a million different kinds of food. So,
I've heard it being, I heard it from my professor as something of a certain type of cooked fish or something, but would parallel very something similar to the idea of where is the meat, where's the fish, where's the beef, like that kind of question. Yeah.
And it totally can be. And also the word, I mean, it comes up in the Gorgias too. So, the stuff in the Gorgias about the knacks and the crafts, we have like the pastry chef in the Zale translation, but it's not really pastries. It's like, again, it's Absa, and it could be, like cooked fish. It could, in the Homeric sense, it could just be like the oxen or whatever. What kind of meat did they eat? I don't know, whatever livestock they ate. But it could also be like sausage, it's, but yeah, something in that, it's not bread, something in that area. And I think Dombrowski might be pushing it a bit, but I do think it's interesting just to think about like how important I think the fact that Socrates describes the true and healthy city with no meat being eaten, and then like gives a direct connection for like why needing meat is going to cause war, I think it's pretty suggestive. Especially when you take out stuff like the statesman myth and the pacifist kind of lines elsewhere. I agree it's hard to call him a total pacifist. But I did want to say a little bit, like, I mean, it is a really radical principle that he says in the Crito and Republic 1, and I think we can find other places. In the Gorgias, it actually comes up too. The Cleitophon has a good example of it, where Socrates just says the good man will never harm anybody, no matter what it's not just like no retaliation, but also like no preventing greater harms by no harming anyone, which to me is actually a pretty radical pacifistic principle. Could also sort of take it together with some of the Platonic stuff about, I think it connects to nobody does injustice willingly, because I think there's always some kind of injustice for Plato in harming anyone, because everyone is kind of radically innocent. This is kind of going to AG's question, but like, I'm blathering. I mean, this is like my dissertation, so I'm telling you what I'm writing my dissertation about. But I think you can try to make some sort of argument, like, why does this matter? Well, it seems like, people are still, being like moral responsibility skeptics nowadays, and, opposing certain kinds of retaliation nowadays. And it seems like Plato does have some arguments for that in his corpus, I think. So, to the extent that those have any bearing on the modern debate, I guess I'd say that could be part of why it matters. But,
I'm curious what you'd think then, is the sticking point that I had when making that original case to a professor was that in the Gorgias, when he describes, when he separates these kinds of harm, that the idea that the good man can't be harmed, because, or it may be more so in the Phaedo than maybe the Gorgias, but it's present in the Gorgias too. The idea that since the soul is immortal, it will preserve. It's where all the good stuff is, where all the virtue is, the intellect, everything. Harming the body will not harm the good man. So obviously, killing a person won't result in a harm. So therefore, the thing about Crito would only apply to, doing an unjust killing and not like a just killing, which is an interesting, I still feel like there might be a way in and around it, but it is difficult to get away from the idea that, killing the body doesn't harm the innocent. So that would make it difficult with a pacifist. So I'm curious what you would say confronted with that, because
so does he have this like strange notion of harm where it's got to be like moral corruption? Eric Brown kind of takes this line, and I mean maybe, but I think you kind of pointed this out earlier. Like a lot of times when Socrates talks about it, he does use comparative language. He doesn't say, the greatest of harms is harm to the soul and nothing else is a harm. He says it's greater than the bodily harms, but he even seems to say things like you wouldn't want to live with a body in terrible condition. He talks about this in the Republic. He talks about this in the Gorgias. I think, there's a lot to say on this. It seems like in the Apology, part of the reason he doesn't want to go to prison or exile is because those would harm him, even though they're not going to corrupt him. It seems like a much more mundane kind of harm. And I guess, you can also say, there's a sense in which it seems like, this is controversial too, but I want to say for Plato and for Socrates, eudaimonia, something like, it is sort of just having a bunch of good things and not having bad things. And I do think that they think that like lack of health is a bad thing. You can see that in the laws, for example. There's divine goods, which are like the parts of virtue, but there's also these human goods: health, strength, beauty, and then wealth, which is kind of a different sort, but it's still a human good. And so being deprived of the human goods would compromise your welfare to some extent, even though, of course, the soul, the virtue ones are way, way more important and everything depends on the virtue ones. It's still the case that the bodily ones have some bearing on like how well your life is going. That's my basic line, but it is a very hard question because he's so into the soul stuff that sometimes it does sound like he's saying, he says things that sound very close to the only kind of harm you can have is, this injustice entering your soul. So it's tricky. Good. Yeah, so I guess we're about out of time. I think yeah, maybe Christopher can help me with this, but is there break until 1 Pacific now? Is that right? And then we'll come back for the keynote or whatever it's called. And I assume we can stay in this room or head to like room A or something if we like. So yeah, good. Let's applaud our speaker, of course. Excellent presentation. And yeah, thanks everybody. This is awesome.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, AG.
I was gonna say I like these kind of laid back, more collaborative talk, conversation type structures. And yeah, Michael, you did a great job. Thanks for the paper.
Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like Q&A is always too short, so it's nice to have the like long Q&A, 45 minutes of Q&A on the shorter talk. That's really fun, especially when I'm gonna like talk as much as
well, I appreciated it.
No, it's funny because I really am writing my dissertation on like the Cogtweeto and Republic stuff on anti-harm, anti-retaliation principles. So I was like, this talk is like about my dissertation. I'm just gonna fucking So, but
well, I appreciate it because I was working on this and like I've been working like my professors were actually included Eric Brown and
nice.
And then I worked more with Eric Weiland, but like so it was one of those though, like I reached a point where I'm like, I can't go further than this. So this is actually what I was looking for. So thanks.
Good. Yeah. The one last thing so it's really weird, and this is a problem from my view, but like it's really weird that Socrates does military service during the Peloponnesian War. It's not a very good war. Like you look at some of those battles, Athenians are not being very virtuous. And yeah, like I have a lot of trouble squaring that. It's not clear that he ever like kills anyone, but he isn't like it's a long time. He spends a lot of his life, like quite a few years, on these campaigns, and it's a puzzle, like what to do with that. How to put that together with what he says in the Cogtweeto about how he's so committed to this like anti-harm principle. It's like how could that possibly go with the war service? So that is a hard question.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially I mean in that. It doesn't fit the city-state. It's not a war for preserving the city-state health.
Right.
It's a war of empire alliances, which is a very interesting. Because I mean, there's a similar problem with there's also a similar problem with the war if you think about like Paul and aspects like that when you think about the Christian pacifist tradition. But like when you specifically think about the just war of like how Socrates is arguing for it here, like the idea that there is that war is specifically for a very specific reason that is anti to the entire reason why the inclusion of war here is, because it's not about preserving the life and getting more land and getting more resources. It's specifically just empire, Hellenistic empire, imperial control. Is it Spartans alliance or is it Athens? Which is interesting. Yeah, like you said, interesting.
It's a problem for me. I think it's also a problem for like everyone though, because even if you take like the Eric Brown view on harm, it seems like it's a problem of justice because it really seems like the Athenians are doing unjust things in the war. And so like how can it seems like Socrates has a weird view of justice if he's like, well, I'm just gonna like participate in this unjust war, but I'm totally like blameless. I'm not doing anything unjust. Like that seems like a weird thing. But so did he find some way to like participate in the war without doing injustice? That's kind of what I think, but it's kind of a and what we see him doing in the symposium is like doing a bunch of philosophy on campaign. So he just like sits around thinking about stuff, and all the soldiers are like, "What the hell is this guy? What is Socrates' deal?" And then, of course, when he's retreating, he's like he's intimidating the enemy so they don't approach him, and he protects Alcibiades, and says that he's actually more collected than Laches. He's braver than Laches in the traditional sense. So he's never shown like stabbing someone or killing someone or doing anything. He talks in the Apology about how you can do these like underhanded things in war to preserve your life, but he wouldn't do them. So there's maybe some, but at the same time, it's like, if you're in a battle, what else is he going to do but harm people if he's in, it's hard to, it's very strange. And then I think we should wonder too, how that like with Plato's military service question, it seems to me that they both have this kind of strong pacifistic principle. So I think it's worth wondering, like if Plato would have wanted to serve in the military when he was 20 or 25 or whatever. Yeah, it's unclear whether he did, but is it possible that he would have avoided it if he could because of considerations that relate to this kind of no harm?
I just find it odd that the commonalities, the common turns of phrase, the interlocutors might just be because of the people around, but the turns of phrase, the metaphors being commonly pointing to military, which is interesting. I mean, if it's explained by Socrates, but it makes it even more interesting regarding Plato. If for some reason he didn't have military service and he would be possibly more pacifistic, why the military metaphors and language actually ramps up in the Republic in comparison to the Socratic dialogues to some degree. Again, like using a military metaphor, even Tertullian, who's a very is a very Christian anti-war pacifist, used military language regarding the descriptions. But it's still interesting that it ramps up, though, if the person who's in question of pacifism or not. I don't know. Yeah. It's stuff like this that I don't feel like I have a coherent view of it, but it's interesting that it's all like just clustering around. I just don't have a line driven through it yet.
There's a striking moment at the beginning of the Charmides where Socrates gets back from the battle. I think it's Potidaea, and then they make him answer questions about what just happened, and like a bunch of his comrades have just died. But in the dialogue, he doesn't he just says I satisfied all their questions, and then as soon as I could talk, I asked how philosophy was going with the young men here. So he doesn't seem to care about talking about it. And Plato kind of skips over, Plato doesn't say, oh, then they asked this, and he said this, he just kind of tells us that the conversation happened, and then immediately gets to let's find out if Charmides has temperance. We get to the young men in philosophy. So it feels like in some strange way, Socrates just isn't very keen on going through the details of his service. Of course, yeah, I kind of wondered about the PTSD connected. Is there any way that it's is it that sort of thing, or is it just? But I guess I tend to think it's just that Socrates is a very strange person who's not concerned with a lot of things that other people are, and pretty much all he ever wants to do is talk about the souls of young men and philosophy, and so this kind of goes under the he doesn't care about the body, he doesn't care about money, he doesn't care about reputation in the way that other people do, and this might just be one of those things. The incidents in the physical world of this battle are just not his concern compared to this realm of the forms where the parts of virtue live. Yeah, the other thing was because maybe Plato had military training. That's also a possibility. Even if he didn't serve in the military, he could have had some training and preparation. But I think that too is unclear. Although, as you point out, it's worth wondering whether the extent to which he writes about it makes you think we might have been had some firsthand knowledge. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks for coming here, EK. Cool. All right, see you, Agent. I guess it's gone. Well, yeah, I probably should get something to eat or something like that, but it's good to actually meet and talk with you, Thomas.
Yeah. Thanks, Sanjana. Thanks, everybody. Are you going to try to submit? I think, it's on your website. Are you going to try to submit this to some kind of journals, or is there a plan for the future?
I submitted to one other conference on actually themed on peace studies or environmental studies or something like that. But I need to do some tweaking to the paper, but that's in October, I think. So I'll hear back in the next couple of weeks, but we'll see. I actually do more Hannah Arendt, philosophy of religion, political theology stuff more. So this is kind of a little out of my wheelhouse, but it's still tangentially connected because of the political theology and Hannah Arendt. But
yeah. I think the uptake thing is really cool. One thing I've been working on recently is incurability in Plato, especially and looking at Olympiodorus and how the Neoplatonists tried to spin it. And it's interesting because as so often with Plato, right, he'll say a lot of things that are hard to interpret or might even seem contradictory, and then everyone's got their version of what Plato is saying afterwards. And it seems like the Neoplatonists want to take him in a direction that's I don't know whether to say pacifistic is the right word. It's very gentle, let's say, because basically they tend to say that he didn't actually think anyone was incurable. And so when there are these descriptions of seemingly eternal punishments in the Gorgias, they have ways of saying that's not really what Plato thought about like the ultimate fate of these people's souls. But of course, a lot of contemporary readers think that he does think that, your soul can become so vicious that it simply can't be cured. And I guess it's kind of how Christians talk about hell sometimes, right? It's like you just get into this state that's like so far from God, or in this case, so far from the good, that there's just you've kind of created your own, place of damnation, and you can't really be rescued from it at some point. So that stuff, I think definitely with the war too, it'd be really interesting to kind of see like the Neoplatonist and then the Christian like what they did with what Plato was saying is a super interesting question, I think.
Which is curious because obviously of any Christian thinker outside of the Islamic gate world, Islamic world had more uptake in Plato until around 900 AD-ish, and that's when Aristotle became the huge uptake in the Latin and Islamic traditions. Obviously, Augustine is the most significant figure that would probably be the most Platonic. Everyone else is going to be still way too bred into either some type of theology or Gnostic or Jewish thought for the most part. I guess maybe like Pseudo Dionysius or Dionysius, or I'm trying to think in Christian tradition. But the concern though with the Augustine is that's not even solid either, because the more and more I keep reading about it, the more and more I think there is strong stoicism to his metaphysics and ethics, even more than the Neo. I mean, not more than Neoplatonic, but there is a Neoplatonic and a Stoic, which is obviously interesting, plus the Jewish Christian aspect. So I mean, obviously it's one of those interesting things I need to piece apart. I still think if there is a philosophical justification for just war, that's not just some theological or political thing, it would probably come from the Platonic strand and less so the Stoic for Augustine. But I'm curious.
Interesting.
I'm just curious because I would assume the Stoic would say that the external world, not to put more stock into the internal instead of the external. The Platonic would be the closest to allow for the care of the internal, but also care for the external.
Yeah, that does end up being, I think, it's always hard to interpret Plato on this, but like, I think certainly compared to the Stoics, arguably even compared to Aristotle, which is kind of surprising, because you might think, oh, Aristotle's the one who's going commonsensical and like letting the bodily stuff matter. But like Eric Brand has a good paper on this actually, where he's like, no, for Aristotle, eudaimonia just really is just virtuous activity, nothing else. But then you might need this like stuff that lets the virtuous activity happen. And actually, for Plato, I'm I think that eudaimonia is just like having a bunch of good stuff. And so, of course, you need including necessarily virtue. Like virtue's got to be in there. But I do think that like it has your health of body has like some bearing on it for Plato, which is a controversial view, but a lot of people do take it. Like Vlastos thinks this, I think Ari Allen. So I'm not like totally out on a limb. And so to that extent, it's interesting that you can sort of say, especially as opposed to the Stoics, that and maybe even like the Epicureans, I mean, or the Cynics, it's like Plato does seem in some way, I mean, people usually think, oh, Plato's so anti-body and he's so all about the, incorporeal and the soul and stuff. But no, it seems like he's in a way according more importance to the body and things like that than some of these other ancient Greek philosophers. And on the just war stuff, I haven't thought about this too much, but I remember one of the sources I was reading was like, Plato talks all the time about war, but he doesn't talk about like the modern concerns with like just war theory. He's not telling us like when, so he has like a different interest in war than like the scholars nowadays tend to. I haven't thought too much about that, but I guess with the Peloponnesian War, I always kind of wonder, like, it seems like you can see some occasional maybe like thoughts about it in his works, but like for such a big event, he's not just writing dialogues that are like the Peloponnesian War is bad. He's not just sort of coming out and like telling us what he thinks of the Peloponnesian War.
It is kind of weird. I guess I think I'm just putting some things together. It almost seems that his descriptions of war are like a biological historical phenomenon. It's like some natural thing that occurs, like a hurricane or something like that, one then must act ethically within. I don't
Yeah.
think it's weird. Now I think about it, I'm trying to think if there's any case in which he is arguing regarding to initiate or not to initiate a war, or to end or not to end a war. It seems to be just kind of like this phenomenon, and that one's thrown into, pardon the Heideggerian phrase, and then you just have to act ethically in. Like, now that I think about it, is I think until like after Hobbes or something, I'm trying to think. I don't think he's do you think do you know of a dialogue that he's like whether or not one should go to war or not? I don't think so. I think it's more of like, how should a soldier behave if you're in war?
There's one thing that brought to mind. I mean, it's not so in the Alcibiades one, there's something that kind of bears on that, where Alcibiades says you might have to so they're talking about like the just and the noble and the good. And basically Alcibiades says there might be these people who haven't done any injustice to us, but we might find it necessary to attack them anyway. You know, the idea being something like it could be good for our city to attack these people who haven't done us any injustice, even though that wouldn't be just, but it might be good, right? So we're going to pull apart the good and the just. And of course, as is typical for Plato, he's not going to admit that the good and the just can come apart that way. So, so what Alcibiades said, I'm just looking it up. Those who are treating us, even if someone thought it was necessary to wage war on people who were treating us justly, he wouldn't admit it, says Alcibiades, because you got to like do the Straussian, like you got to. So, and then Socrates says it wouldn't be lawful. It wouldn't be this, that, and the other thing. And Alcibiades admits that. Alcibiades seems to think that it would be good, but it wouldn't be kalos, and it wouldn't be noble, and it wouldn't be just. And I think so. Socrates is going to say you can't initiate a war unless it's good, noble, and just to do so. But of course, that's a very high level. Like, I mean, I think, as you know, like that's a very when is it good, noble, and just to do so? You know?
Yeah.
It's always a hard question for Plato because the good is so difficult. But I think that that's the only thing I could think of. It's like Alcibiades 109c where they talk about that. And but besides that, I mean, there's discussions of like, defense, like in Republic, right? There's like, or in laws, like having the city in a place that's like well situated to defend itself and isn't going to provoke people to. But there's not a whole lot of like
questions how to deal with innocents or people observing the war to prevent, to allow for training and experience without unjust killings.
But I guess I would say, like, to me it seems like this is a question that is too political in a so of course, like, Socrates and Plato are very concerned with politics in some sense, but they don't want to talk about like, building dockyards and like specific wars. It's like, to me it seems a little bit too specific for them because they want to go really abstract, high level, talk about the good, the just, and the noble, and these kind of find the definition or like find the essence of these things. But a question like, should the Athenians have gone to war with or should the Athenians have like killed the Melians or whatever is like very interesting question to us, I think. But to them, I don't know. It seems like this is one of the things that Socrates at the beginning of the Charmides just doesn't have that much interest in talking about relative to, philosophy and the young men.
I think that Socrates' defense, and I think it's a very decent one, is that he's not concerned with like, truth in the sense of getting the correct answer here. His actual method of Socratic dialogue his intent is to create a virtuous public, virtuous people, virtuous citizenry, so that way when they're put in these situations they can respond appropriately. That he would just say like, I'm not trying to get to the policy, like they come with, should we train our, in the Laches, should we train these kids with this teacher or not? It's not that question. It's more like, okay, so let's make you guys better virtuous citizens, and then you'll find the good teachers. I think that's where he's starting it at. He's not going to look for the correct answer in the semantic, textual, propositional sense, but more in the character building, virtue sense. Anyways.
I think that's right. Definitely, like the digression in the Theaetetus has a lot of bearing on this. We talked about this philosopher who's this person that's like very impractical, and people just think his like head is in the clouds all the time. Like, oh, there are these important questions that the philosopher is ignoring, but it seems like Plato and Socrates are saying, no, he's answering the important questions, but you people are talking about trivia. About, how much land does this person have, and what political intrigue is that person getting into, and all this stuff.
And to be fair, that kind of response is the only way. It fails. The only response to the apologia, his defense would work if he's saying, I'm not trying to corrupt the youth, I'm just trying to improve their character and teach them and be there. If it was though a matter of political intrigue, then you have this different treason question, whereas instead it's a pedagogical citizen improvement virtue debate instead of a question of, are you advocating for something that the council is going to be undermined politically? Like, I think that's why the apologia would be structured that way, is if he's operating under that way, thinks of himself operating that way, and other people perceive him to be operating that way.
Right. Yeah, even like in the laws, because the laws you might think is like when Plato changes his mind, or, if you want to go really developmentalist, it's like, oh, well, in the Socratic stuff, Socrates is always, doing what he thinks is like the true politics, but staying out of like the normal politics. And, he says he's going to get killed if he does it and stuff. But in the laws, you might think, oh, but Plato is conceding that we have to do the normal politics because he spends so much time like talking about laws and stuff. But even in the laws at the end, the Athenian stranger seems to refuse to like help found the city. He's like, I'll talk to you about education all you want. Like, I'll talk to you forever about education, like how to set up an educational system. But Clinius and Megillus are like, hey, you should actually like help us found the city. And he's like, don't want to do that. Which seems to me like even to the very end, Plato is like refusing to sort of descend to the real practical level in some way. Even he's conceding some ground in the laws, it seems like, but even so, he's like, but the philosopher really is not properly concerned with some of these specific things. So he's still sort of holding the line even on that.
Fair. Well, it's good to talk to you. I'm going to go quick grab something, but it's a pleasure to actually meet you.
You can send me the paper if you like. Sure. I'm happy to give some thoughts. And like I said, there's a lot of overlaps. So you could probably working on similar questions with the pacifism. And then just Thomas.Bon at Colorado. Yeah, it's just my name at colorado.edu.
Let's see. Do you have a? Are you one of the philosophy Twitter people, or are you just?
I am. Yeah, I'll put everything in the.
Yeah, put it in there, and I'll probably DM you to
and then
sort out.
Hieronymus Bosch. That's my Twitter at.
Okay, perfect.
Hieronymus Bosch, but my last name. And so try to get up. So if you ever want to send any talk about it, I'll
probably send a draft, because like I said, I would actually appreciate some more critical feedback on this. As I said, the professor that was reviewing it and some other people weren't there, like especially the professor I was working with is more social philosophy and action theory and stuff like that, so he gave me some decent pointers, but at the same time wasn't in the minutia. So I'm curious what you would say.
And I guess I would say I'm kind of the opposite, where I've read a little bit of Arendt. I kind of liked I forget what it was called, but I read one of her essays about I think it was about like ancient Greek philosophy, sort of. I should look it up, but I have increasingly just read Plato in grad school. You just start talking in general, but then the longer you get into it, the more you're just so. I'm somewhat helpful on the specifically Plato, like ancient Greek stuff, but then with a lot of other political philosophy, I'm quite useless.
That's fair. I am specifically aiming this to be into the ancient Greek ethics concern, so that's why I would appreciate your thought. Like I could, totally. if I expand further than that, I can find someone else still. But thanks. But it's a pleasure meeting you, and I'll probably follow you later. So.
What's your Twitter? What's your ad?
It's basically my name just flipped. It's literally that. It's my name just in backwards order.
Sounds good. Alrighty, well, I guess I'll probably see you in the keynote if you're in there.
Maybe not. I'm still not sure if I'm gonna. I think there's something that might be scheduled, but I'll probably talk with you. Hopefully at some other Cogtweeto.
I found it. Wait, did you mention this? It was Truth and Politics. That's the one that we did like a reading group on.
Truth and Politics. Oh, that would be in the Between Past and Future.
It's in like a
collection.
Right.
What Sanjana was mentioning, and I'll send the name to you later. There is a essay series book that was published posthumously by Hannah that obviously she uses a lot of Socratic stuff, like the being at war with oneself, like this kind of this or in disagreement with oneself, and all these other things that are the works. But there is one essay that's specifically on Socrates that is a fairly decent like collection of what she actually thinks across her canon. It's like it's a weird essay, but it's in The Promise of Politics. But I'll send it to you later.
Oh, The Promise of Politics, right? Yeah, that's right.
The first essay or so is specifically on Socrates / Plato and her thoughts. Obviously, I know for sure that you'll disagree with quite a bit of it. But if you're interested in like what she would say on Plato, that would probably be
totally.
the most authoritative of it.
No,
and
definitely.
I just copy whatever that is into mine as well.
Yeah, I was just pasting the thing. This struck me. I don't know if it's true or not, but she has this view that like the Greeks kind of like started impartiality, right? Like they say like sing not only of the Greeks' great deeds, but of the Trojans as well. And Herodotus talks about the great deeds of the Persians as well as the Greeks. And she thinks that's like super distinctive and like before that, people were like really, biased towards their people, but the Greeks are just like super curious about what are the Persians up to. Praise the Persians for a while. So I don't know if that's
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me as a little bit. I was like, wait, is this kind of like Western civilization like superiorist a little bit? But I don't know enough history to like judge it. But it is true. I think she is right that like the Greeks do have this kind of striking. Like not all the Greek people had this, but like I think Plato and Herodotus and Homer were very interested in like what the so-called barbarians were up to, and we're quite willing to praise them. Alcibiades one, he praises the Persian customs, like quite willing to praise them when they were doing good.
Obviously, though, you have the outlier that's both in this view and out of this view in Aristotle, in which when you look at the constitutions and the politics, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to praise others and see what works. And then when you look at the first part of the politics, you're like, oh, obviously, though, he is not as praiseworthy of the barbarians. Right. But no, I mean, I will say that's the one concern with Hannah is that she does sadly play fast and loose. And sometimes it's like it's fast and loose, and to the point where I'm like, you're right. You're not right because of the quote you sourced it from.
Yeah.
Like it makes sense, but because I do a lot of political theology, the way she exegetes like scriptural passages, and then I find literally on the next page like the exact opposite. And I'm like, I've had similar problems with Aristotle and Plato with her, and a lot of people have that. So she's interesting. I love her to death, but sadly she will play fast and loose for you being a original text purist.
That can be fun, honestly. Like it's often more fun to read like a really interesting like original author who kind of like fudges the Plato as opposed to like a scholar who's super careful but just doesn't say anything interesting. Like you're like, well,
will say
this is less true, but it's like super fun to think about. But then I'm like, but I mean, whereas the way that it works in like the stuff that's getting published in Apeiron or whatever is like very careful, very well sourced, but sometimes they talk about these questions where you're like, why does this matter? It's this tiny little hermeneutic thing, and like, it just doesn't seem like we're really talking about the big issues anymore. Which I like, do philosophy because I like talking about the big stuff. So but cool. All right, so I think I just followed you. All right, but I'll let you get some lunch or whatnot, and cool. Thanks for the talk. This was really fun.
Yeah,
awesome.
Thank you so much for hosting. Yeah, I'll chat with you later.